You know that moment right before something important happens? When your brain starts screaming, "Stay calm," and your body does the exact opposite? Heart pounding, thoughts racing, hands shaking, and the more you tell yourself to calm down, the worse it gets. Yeah, that's not an accident. Turns out, psychologists figured out over 100 years ago that trying to force calmness triggers the exact physiological response you're trying to avoid. It's like trying not to think about a polar bear. The suppression itself becomes the problem, and people can spend years trapped in this pattern. Athletes who choke, professionals who freeze during presentations, parents who panic during emergencies, smart, capable, trained people who just can't seem to hold it together when pressure hits. But here's what's interesting. During World War II, as military researchers started noticing something weird. The pilots who survived combat weren't the ones following the "stay calm" advice. They were doing something completely different. And then NASA saw the same pattern with astronauts, and surgeons noticed it in operating rooms, and firefighters saw it in burning buildings. There's a method that works, but it requires you to stop doing what feels natural. Stop trying to eliminate fear. Stop forcing relaxation. Stop fighting your own stress response. I know that sounds backwards, but history proves it works. Before we dive in, I just want to say, if pressure makes you freeze, if stress makes you panic, if you feel like your body betrays you when it matters most, you're not alone. I get messages every day from people struggling with this, from students, professionals, parents, performers, all asking the same question: how do I stay calm when everything's falling apart? This is for all of you. Lieutenant James Mitchell was 24 years old when he earned his wings. Top of his class at flight school. Perfect scores on simulation training. His instructors called him a natural. 6 months later, over the English Channel in 1943, he froze at the controls during his first real dogfight. His wingman had to pull him out of the dive. Mitchell survived, but he never flew combat again. Dr. Sarah Chen spent 8 years in surgical residency, thousands of hours in operating rooms, flawless technique, steady hands, until the morning a routine procedure went wrong. A patient started bleeding. Chen's hands began shaking so badly she had to step away from the table. Another surgeon finished the operation. Sarah Chen spent the next 3 months on administrative leave, convinced she'd lost her nerve forever. These stories aren't exceptions, they're the pattern. Back in 1884, a psychologist named William James made an observation that would take decades to be taken seriously. He noticed that people don't run because they're afraid. They become afraid because they run. The body's response comes first. The emotion follows, which meant something radical. You can't think your way into calmness. You can't force your nervous system to relax by wanting it badly enough, but nobody listened. Not really. Instead, for over a century, the advice remained the same. Before a big moment, a speech, an interview, a confrontation, an emergency, people were told to take a deep breath, think positive thoughts, visualize success, stay calm. And when that advice failed, which it did repeatedly, people assumed the problem was them. Not strong enough, not disciplined enough, not calm enough. During World War II, military psychologists started tracking something disturbing. Combat pilots who tried hardest to suppress their fear burned out faster than those who didn't. Soldiers ordered to be brave and stay composed showed higher rates of what they called combat fatigue. The ones who acknowledged being terrified, who admitted their hands shook before missions, somehow lasted longer. The data contradicted everything the military believed about courage. Then NASA began studying astronauts during the Mercury and Apollo programs. They wanted to understand who stayed functional during life-threatening emergencies in space. The assumption was simple: find the people who could stay calm under pressure. Train everyone else to be like them, but that's not what they found. The astronauts who performed best during critical failures weren't calm. Their heart rates spiked. Stress hormones flooded their systems. They were, by every physiological measure, under extreme duress. But they didn't collapse. They didn't freeze. They executed procedures with precision while their bodies screamed danger. NASA realized they'd been asking the wrong question. It wasn't about finding people who could stay calm. It was about finding people who could function despite not being calm. In emergency rooms, the pattern repeated. Surgeons who tried to relax before high-stakes procedures often performed worse than those who accepted their elevated heart rate and shaking hands as normal. And the firefighters who fought their adrenaline response made more mistakes than those who learned to work with it. Hostage negotiators who waited to feel calm before engaging often missed critical windows. The evidence kept pointing to the same uncomfortable truth. Trying to calm yourself down under genuine pressure doesn't work. In fact, it often makes things worse. Because here's what happens in your body when you tell yourself to stay calm during a real threat. Your brain interprets the stress response, racing heart, rapid breathing, heightened alertness, as a sign of danger. Then you add a second layer, trying to suppress that response. Your nervous system now has two problems: the original threat and your resistance to your own biology. This creates what psychologists call a meta-emotion. You're not just stressed. You're stressed about being stressed. You're panicking about panicking. And that doubling effect is what causes people to collapse under pressure. Mitchell wasn't weak. Chen wasn't incompetent. They were both fighting a battle they couldn't win, trying to force their bodies into a state of calm while those same bodies were designed, through millions of years of evolution, to activate under threat. The military eventually changed its training. So did NASA. Modern emergency medicine now teaches a completely different approach. Because the research became impossible to ignore, calmness under pressure isn't about feeling relaxed. It's about maintaining functional clarity while your nervous system does exactly what it's supposed to do. Calm isn't a mood you achieve, it's a process you enter. But entering that process requires unlearning 5 deeply embedded mistakes. Mistakes that appear in every field where pressure matters. Mistakes that separate the people who perform from the people who freeze. The first mistake? Believing that fear is something you need to eliminate before you can act effectively. History proves otherwise. Mistake number 1, suppressing fear. In 1942, the Royal Air Force had a problem they couldn't solve with better planes or more training. Pilots were breaking down at unprecedented rates. Not from lack of skill, not from insufficient preparation. They were mentally collapsing after only a handful of combat missions. The official term was lack of moral fiber. The unofficial truth was simpler. These men were terrified, and they'd been ordered not to be. British military doctrine was clear. Fear was weakness. Courage meant feeling no fear. So pilots who admitted being scared were labeled cowards, removed from duty, shamed. The message was unmistakable. Suppress it, push it down, be fearless, and it destroyed them. By 1943, the RAF was losing more pilots to psychiatric breakdown than to enemy fire in some squadrons. The American Air Force saw the same pattern. Young men who'd performed flawlessly in training would fly 3, maybe 4 missions, then refuse to get back in the cockpit. Some developed tremors so severe they couldn't hold a cup. Others stopped sleeping entirely. Military psychologists were brought in to study the phenomenon. What they discovered contradicted a century of military thinking. The pilots who lasted longest under sustained combat stress weren't the ones who claimed to feel no fear. That they were the ones who admitted, often privately to medical officers, that they were scared every single time they flew. They described the nausea before missions, the shaking hands during pre-flight checks, the intrusive thoughts about being shot down. But here's what made them different. They flew anyway. The pilots who broke down fastest were the ones who'd internalized the fearless doctrine most completely. They treated fear as a moral failure, something to be ashamed of, something to hide. So when fear appeared, and it always appeared, they fought it. They tried to push it away. They told themselves real pilots don't feel this way, and that internal war consumed them. One British flight surgeon named Charles Simons documented the pattern in a 1943 report that would change military psychiatry. That he found that pilots who suppressed fear showed higher resting heart rates between missions, more difficulty sleeping, greater startle responses. Their bodies remained in a constant state of high alert, even on the ground. Meanwhile, pilots who acknowledged fear, who said, "Yes, I'm terrified and I'm going up anyway," showed lower baseline stress markers. They slept better, recovered faster between missions, lasted longer in combat rotations. The data forced an uncomfortable question. What if fear suppression wasn't discipline? What if it was the problem? Simons's research led to a radical shift in British military psychology. Pilots were told that fear was normal, expected, rational. The goal wasn't to eliminate it. The goal was to function despite it. As the squadrons that adopted this approach saw psychiatric casualty rates drop by nearly 40%. The Americans reached the same conclusion independently. General George Marshall commissioned a study on combat effectiveness that found suppression of fear was one of the strongest predictors of breakdown. Not the presence of fear, the attempt to deny it. But why? What was happening in the body that made suppression so destructive? Decades later, psychologist Daniel Wegner would formalize this with the white bear experiments. Tell someone not to think about a white bear, and that's all they can think about. The act of suppression requires monitoring for the forbidden thought, which keeps it active in consciousness. Fear works the same way. Trying not to feel afraid requires constant checking. Am I afraid? Am I showing fear? Is my fear visible? Each check activates the fear response again. The suppression becomes a loop that feeds itself. Neurologically, fear suppression triggers the sympathetic nervous system, the fight-or-flight response. Your body interprets the effort to suppress as confirmation of danger. Heart rate increases. Stress hormones release. The very state you're trying to avoid intensifies. Modern PTSD research confirmed what those World War II flight surgeons observed. Veterans who tried to suppress traumatic memories showed worse long-term outcomes than those who processed them. Acceptance-based therapies, which teach people to acknowledge fear without judgment, consistently outperform suppression-based approaches. The U.S. military eventually rewrote its combat stress training. Navy SEALs aren't taught to eliminate fear, as they're taught to recognize it, name it, and continue the mission. Army Rangers learn that fear is data, information about risk that can inform decisions without controlling behavior. Elite units now screen for this capacity, not fearlessness, the ability to act effectively while afraid. Because here's what history proved across thousands of combat missions, hundreds of psychological studies, and decades of military evolution. Fear ignored doesn't disappear. It amplifies. It burrows deeper. It takes more energy to suppress than to acknowledge. Fear acknowledged becomes something different, not comfortable, not pleasant, but manageable, workable. Information instead of identity. The pilots who survived weren't the ones who conquered fear. They were the ones who stopped fighting it, who said, "Yes, I'm afraid. Now what's the next action?" That shift, from suppression to acknowledgement, was the difference between breaking down after 4 missions and completing 30. Fear wasn't the enemy. Resistance to fear was. And that resistance showed up in 4 other mistakes, each one documented across different high-pressure fields, each one making the same fundamental error, treating the body's stress response as something to overcome rather than something to work with. The second mistake emerged most clearly not in war, but in space. Mistake number 2, trying to relax on command. April 13, 1970. Apollo 13, 200,000 miles from Earth. An oxygen tank exploded. The spacecraft was venting atmosphere into space. 3 astronauts had minutes to execute a series of procedures that had never been tested in real conditions, or they'd suffocate before reaching home. Commander Jim Lovell's heart rate, monitored by NASA biosensors, spiked to 146 beats per minute. Normal resting rate, 68. By every physiological measure, Lovell was in acute stress. His body was screaming danger, but his voice on the radio stayed level. His hands executed checklists with precision. He and his crew methodically shut down the command module, transferred to the lunar lander, calculated a return trajectory using minimal power. They never relaxed, not for a second during the 87-hour return to Earth. But they stayed regulated. NASA had learned something critical by 1970, though it took them nearly a decade to figure it out. Something that contradicted everything in their early astronaut training manuals. When the Mercury program began in 1959, that NASA's psychological screening prioritized one trait above all others: the ability to remain calm under pressure. They wanted men who could relax in crisis. They put candidates through sensory deprivation, centrifuge tests, and simulated emergencies, looking for the ones whose heart rate stayed lowest. They found them. Pilots who could keep their pulse steady during violent G-forces. Men who showed minimal stress responses during isolation tests. NASA was convinced they'd identified the perfect psychological profile. Then they started sending these men into space, and the training failed to predict performance. Some of the astronauts who'd shown the calmest baseline measures froze during actual emergencies. In 1966, during Gemini 8, Neil Armstrong and David Scott's spacecraft began tumbling out of control. Scott's training had emphasized relaxation techniques, controlled breathing, mental imagery, progressive muscle relaxation. None of it worked at 8,000 miles per hour while spinning end over end. What worked was procedure. Armstrong didn't try to calm down. He went through the emergency checklist, step by step, while his inner ear screamed and his body fought spatial disorientation. The spacecraft stabilized not because Armstrong felt relaxed, but because he executed a sequence of actions while feeling absolutely terrible. NASA's chief psychologist, Patricia Santi, later reviewed decades of astronaut performance data. Her finding upended the selection criteria. Relaxation capacity had almost no correlation with crisis performance. What mattered was procedural adherence under duress. The astronauts who performed best during emergencies weren't the ones who could relax fastest. They were the ones who could ignore their inability to relax and focus on the next concrete action. Because here's what NASA's physiologists eventually understood. You cannot activate the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest response, during an actual threat. The biology doesn't work that way. When your body detects danger, the sympathetic nervous system takes over. Heart rate increases. Blood flow redirects to major muscles. Digestion stops. Fine motor control diminishes. This isn't a malfunction. This is survival architecture refined over millions of years. Trying to force relaxation during this state is like trying to sleep while running. The systems are incompatible. You see, the harder you try to relax while your body is in threat mode, the more you create internal conflict. Your nervous system receives contradictory signals. Danger, but pretend there's no danger. The confusion amplifies the stress response. NASA stopped teaching relaxation techniques for crisis scenarios. Instead, they trained procedural automaticity, checklists, verbal protocols, sequences practiced until they became reflexive. The goal shifted from stay calm to execute regardless of calm. This same pattern appeared in other high-pressure fields once researchers started looking for it. Olympic athletes don't relax before major competitions. Studies of sprinters before the 100-meter final show heart rates averaging 130 beats per minute while still in the starting blocks. That's not calm, that's full activation. But elite athletes have learned not to interpret that activation as a problem requiring a solution. Distance runner Frank Shorter described his pre-Olympic marathon state as controlled panic. His body was in complete sympathetic overdrive, but his attention was on pacing, hydration, competitors, not on trying to calm down. Surgeons before complex operations show the same elevated physiological markers. A 2009 study of cardiac surgeons found pre-procedure heart rates averaging 20 to 30% above baseline. The surgeons who performed best weren't the ones with the lowest heart rates. They were the ones who focused on their first incision, their instrument setup, their team communication, not on their internal state. Dr. Atul Gawande documented this in his research on surgical error. He found that surgeons who spent mental energy trying to relax before operations made more mistakes than those who used that same pre-procedure time reviewing anatomy or confirming patient details. The difference wasn't physiological. It was attentional. Regulation, it turns out, doesn't require tranquility. Regulation requires directing attention away from internal state and toward external action. Your heart can race. Your palms can sweat. Your breathing can be shallow. None of that prevents functional behavior if your attention is anchored to something concrete. This is why telling someone to calm down during a crisis is not just unhelpful, it's actively counterproductive. It directs attention inward, toward the very sensations that signal threat, as it asks the person to solve an unsolvable problem, feel different while the danger is still present. What actually works is redirection, not relax, but what's the next step? Not slow your breathing, but read this checklist. Not don't panic, but execute this procedure. NASA eventually formalized this in what they called task saturation training. Fill the astronauts' attention completely with procedural demands, leaving no cognitive space for meta-worry about their stress state. The regulation emerges as a side effect of proper engagement, not as a prerequisite for it. Lovell didn't bring Apollo 13 home because he was calm. He brought it home because he never tried to be calm. His attention stayed locked on procedures while his body remained in crisis mode for nearly 4 days straight. Relaxation was optional. Regulation was mandatory, and regulation came through focus, not feeling. This realization dismantled another assumption, that you need to fix your internal state before you can act effectively. But history kept proving the opposite. Action fixes the internal state. Engagement creates regulation. The sequence runs backward from what we've been taught, which led to the third mistake, one that showed up most clearly not in space or war, but in operating rooms where a surgeon's next decision could mean life or death. Mistake number 3, outcome fixation. Dr. Atul Gawande spent years studying why some surgeons made more errors than others with identical training and experience. In 2007, he published data that exposed something nobody expected. The surgeons who thought most about succeeding were the ones who failed most often. This wasn't about competence. It was about where their attention went under pressure. Surgical training programs across major teaching hospitals tracked error rates during high-stakes procedures. They found a pattern. Surgeons who reported thinking, "I cannot mess this up," or "this patient needs me to be perfect," during critical moments made more mistakes than those who focused on immediate, concrete actions. A cardiac surgeon at Johns Hopkins described the difference. "When I'm thinking about the outcome, whether the patient survives, whether I'll be blamed if something goes wrong, my hands start making errors I'd never make in simulation. But when I narrow down to make this incision, clamp this vessel, tie this suture, everything else disappears, and the surgery goes better." The explanation came from cognitive science. While working memory, the brain's system for holding and manipulating information, has severe limits. Under normal conditions, it can handle about 4 items simultaneously. Under stress, that capacity shrinks, sometimes to just 1 or 2 items. When a surgeon thinks, "I must save this patient," they're holding multiple variables in working memory: patient outcome, personal responsibility, potential complications, reputation, liability. That's 5 items minimum. Add the technical demands of the procedure, anatomy, instrument placement, bleeding control, and working memory overloads. The brain defaults to what psychologists call cognitive narrowing. Attention collapses. Fine motor control degrades. Pattern recognition fails. The surgeon becomes less capable precisely when capability matters most. But when attention narrows to a single action, stop this bleeding, working memory has space to function. The surgeon sees what they need to see. Their hands do what they're trained to do. Firefighters discovered this independently during burn training in the 1990s. Instructors at the National Fire Academy noticed recruits who thought about saving lives, or not letting anyone die, during structural fire scenarios made dangerous tactical errors. They'd rush into unstable buildings, skip safety protocols, lose track of their team's position. Recruits who focused on procedural steps, check door temperature, stay low, maintain contact with wall, made better decisions under identical pressure. Their situational awareness remained intact. They completed rescues more successfully because they weren't thinking about rescues. They were thinking about the next physical action. A veteran Chicago firefighter described it this way: "The moment I start imagining the person trapped inside, thinking about their family, about what happens if I fail, that's when I freeze or make stupid mistakes. But if I'm just executing the next step in the protocol, my training takes over." The same pattern appeared in financial trading floors during market crashes. During the 2008 financial crisis, researchers studied trader behavior at major investment banks. Traders who fixated on their total portfolio losses, the big picture of catastrophic failure, made increasingly desperate, irrational trades. They doubled down on losing positions, violated their own risk management rules. Many wiped out accounts that could have survived with better decisions. Traders who survived extreme volatility described a different mental state. They stopped looking at total losses. They focused on single trades. This one decision, this one position. What does the data say right now? By fragmenting the crisis into individual moments, they maintained enough cognitive function to execute their training. A Goldman Sachs trader later said, "The guys who kept asking, 'How much am I down?' were the ones who blew up. The guys who asked, 'What's the next trade?' stayed in the game." This isn't just anecdotal. Neuroscience explains the mechanism. When you focus on outcomes, especially negative outcomes, the brain activates threat detection systems in the amygdala. Those systems evolved to scan for danger, not to execute complex tasks. Blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, which handles planning and decision-making. Stress hormones flood the system. The result? Exactly the cognitive state you don't want under pressure. Meanwhile, focusing on immediate actions activates different neural pathways. The motor cortex, the procedural memory systems in the basal ganglia. These systems are more stress-resistant. They function relatively well even under threat conditions because they're older, more fundamental to survival. Emergency room physicians learn this during trauma training. When a patient arrives with multiple life-threatening injuries, doctors who think, "I need to save this person," often falter. There's too much to process, too many simultaneous problems. The scope overwhelms them. But doctors trained in trauma protocols think differently. Control airway, stop bleeding, stabilize circulation. 3 sequential steps. Each step triggers the next. The doctor isn't thinking about whether the patient survives. They're thinking about the current procedure. A trauma surgeon at Boston Medical Center explained, "You can't hold save the patient in your head during a trauma. It's too big, but you can hold insert chest tube. And once that's done, you can hold cross-clamp aorta. Break it down small enough and your brain can actually function." This is why checklists work in high-pressure environments. Not because people are forgetful, but because checklists convert overwhelming outcomes into manageable actions. Instead of "don't crash the plane," pilots have airspeed, altitude, attitude. Instead of "save the patient," surgeons have scalpel, clamp, suture. The reframe is radical but clear. Under pressure, the brain cannot hold both outcome and action simultaneously. You get one or the other. Outcome thinking, "I must succeed," paralyzes. It overloads working memory. It activates threat systems. It degrades performance. Action thinking, "What is the next correct step?" focuses. It preserves cognitive capacity. It accesses trained procedures. It maintains function. History proved this in burning buildings and operating rooms and trading floors. The people who performed best under extreme pressure weren't thinking about winning or losing. They were thinking about the next 5 seconds. Not, "Will I survive this?" but, "What do I do right now?" That shift in attention made the difference between collapse and continuation, between freezing and functioning. But even understanding this, people still made a 4th mistake. As they treated their body's stress response, the racing heart, the adrenaline surge, the heightened alertness, as something that needed to be eliminated before effective action could happen. Combat training would prove that assumption backwards. Mistake number 4, fighting adrenaline. In 1985, the FBI analyzed every officer-involved shooting from the previous decade where law enforcement had been killed or critically injured. The findings were disturbing. In over 60% of cases, officers had ammunition remaining in their weapons. They'd stopped shooting not because they ran out of bullets, but because their fine motor skills collapsed under stress. The culprit, according to training doctrine at the time, was adrenaline. So the solution seemed obvious. Teach officers to suppress their adrenaline response. Lower their heart rate. Stay calm. The FBI and most police academies adopted heart rate control as a core training component. Officers practiced breathing techniques designed to slow their pulse during confrontations. The goal was to keep heart rate below 115 beats per minute, the threshold where fine motor skills supposedly degraded. It didn't work. Officer survival rates didn't improve. In some departments, they got worse. During actual shootings, officers reported the same problems: trembling hands, tunnel vision, auditory exclusion. All the breathing training in the world couldn't override what their bodies were doing under lethal threat. Then, in the early 1990s, special operations units started questioning the entire premise. Navy SEAL trainers noticed something during live fire exercises. The operators who performed best weren't the ones with the lowest heart rates. Some were operating at 145, even 160 beats per minute, well above the supposed degradation threshold. But they were still making accurate shots, still executing complex tactics, still maintaining discipline under chaotic conditions. The difference wasn't in their heart rate. It was in their relationship to the stress response. A SEAL instructor named Dave Grossman studied combat performance across multiple military branches and found that elite units had stopped trying to suppress adrenaline. Instead, they'd redesigned training to work with it. Stress inoculation became the model. Expose soldiers to progressively higher stress levels until their nervous system adapted to functioning in that state. SEALs began training with live ammunition flying overhead. Rangers practiced decision-making while physically exhausted and sleep-deprived. Delta Force operators rehearsed hostage rescues with explosions, smoke, and deliberate chaos injected into scenarios. The goal wasn't calm, it was competence under physiological activation. Because here's what the research actually showed. Adrenaline isn't the enemy of performance, it's fuel for it. When your body releases adrenaline during stress, multiple systems enhance simultaneously. Pupil dilation increases visual acuity. Blood flow to major muscle groups increases strength and speed. Glucose floods the bloodstream, providing immediate energy. Pain perception decreases. Reaction time quickens by up to 20%. This is millions of years of evolution optimizing your body for threat response. The system works. The problem was never adrenaline. The problem was fighting it. When you try to suppress adrenaline while your body is releasing it, you create competing physiological demands. Your sympathetic nervous system activates for action while you're attempting parasympathetic activation for rest. The conflict produces exactly the symptoms officers reported: tremors, tunnel vision, cognitive shutdown. But when you accept the adrenaline response and channel it into action, those symptoms diminish or disappear entirely. A Delta Force operator described it this way: your heart's going to race, your breathing's going to quicken. That's not a problem to fix. That's your body giving you everything it has. The question is, can you use it? Modern tactical training answers that question with something called tactical breathing, but not the old version designed to suppress stress. So the new version uses breath control to maintain cognitive function while keeping the adrenaline system fully engaged. 4-count breathing. Inhale for 4, hold for 4, exhale for 4, hold for 4. It's not relaxation, it's regulation. The distinction matters. Relaxation tries to shut down the stress response. Regulation accepts the stress response and maintains executive function alongside it. Elite athletes discovered the same principle independently. Sprinters used to be taught to stay loose before races. Then performance scientists measured what actually happened in world record sprints. Athletes who posted the fastest times had sky-high adrenaline levels at the starting line. Their hearts were racing. Their muscles were primed. They weren't relaxed. They were coiled. An Olympic sprinter, Michael Johnson, described the sensation. If I felt calm before a race, I knew something was wrong. I wanted to feel that energy, that tension. That meant my body was ready. Powerlifters learned to use adrenaline spikes to access strength beyond their normal capacity. MMA fighters stopped trying to lower their heart rate before fights and instead focused on channeling activation into explosive movement. Emergency medicine made the same shift. Trauma surgeons used to be taught to maintain clinical detachment, to stay emotionally and physiologically neutral. But studies of actual trauma bay performance showed that surgeons with elevated heart rates and adrenaline during critical procedures often made faster, more decisive interventions. A trauma surgeon at Maryland Shock Trauma Center explained, "You need that edge. That heightened state gives you speed and precision you don't have when you're relaxed." The key is knowing the difference between functional activation and panic. Activation moves you forward, panic freezes you. The physiological markers are nearly identical: elevated heart rate, rapid breathing, muscle tension, heightened alertness. But the subjective experience is completely different depending on your interpretation. If you interpret these sensations as your body malfunctioning, as something wrong that needs to be fixed, you trigger a secondary stress response. Stress about being stressed. Your performance degrades. But if you interpret the same sensations as your body optimizing for performance, the secondary response doesn't trigger. The adrenaline becomes usable energy instead of debilitating anxiety. The researchers at Harvard studied this with students before high-stakes exams. One group was told their stress response was harmful and should be minimized. Another group was told their stress response was helpful, that increased heart rate meant more oxygen to the brain, that arousal improved focus. The second group performed significantly better, not because they had less adrenaline, but because they reframed it as functional rather than pathological. Military training now incorporates this reframe explicitly. Rangers are taught, your heart racing means you're ready. Your hands shaking means blood is flowing to where it's needed. Your breathing quickening means your body is preparing for action. These are features, not bugs. The shift in language reflects a fundamental shift in understanding. Adrenaline isn't something to overcome. It's something to direct. A firefighter in Los Angeles described the turning point in his career. I used to fight my body before entering a burning building, try to slow my heart, calm myself down. I'd waste energy on that internal battle. Now I recognize the activation, acknowledge it, and channel it into focused movement. I'm faster, clearer, and more effective because I stopped fighting my own biology. The goal isn't to remove adrenaline, it's to ride it. But even with fear acknowledged, procedures focused, and adrenaline harnessed, people still made one final mistake. The biggest one. They waited to feel calm before taking action. History would prove that backwards. Mistake number 5. Waiting to feel calm. April 13th, 1970. 200,000 miles from Earth. Oxygen tank number 2 exploded on Apollo 13, was crippling the spacecraft's life support systems. 3 astronauts, Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes, faced near certain death in the vacuum of space. The audio recordings from that night captured something unexpected. You can hear it in their voices. Tension, strain, rapid speech. These men were terrified. But listen to what they did. Within seconds of the explosion, Swigert was reading instrument panels. Lovell was checking thruster controls. Hayes was running through emergency procedures. Their voices shook. Their heart rates spiked above 130 beats per minute, according to biomedical telemetry. But their actions remained precise. They never felt calm. Not during the explosion, not during the 4-day return to Earth, not when carbon dioxide levels approached lethal concentrations, not when they had to perform a manual engine burn with failing systems. They acted anyway. Flight Director Gene Kranz, managing the crisis from Houston, later described the ground team's state. We were scared to death, but we had procedures, we had checklists, we had training, so we worked the problem. Nobody waited to feel calm. If they had, all 3 astronauts would have died. This is the pattern that appears across every high-pressure field, every survival situation, every documented case of people performing under extreme stress. Calm doesn't come first. Action does. Then, sometimes, calm follows. Neuroscience explains why. The brain's emotional regulation systems are downstream from action, not upstream. You cannot think your way into a calm state during genuine threat, but you can act your way into one. When you engage in trained procedures, concrete, sequential actions, several things happen neurologically. The motor cortex activates. Procedural memory systems in the basal ganglia take over. These systems are relatively stress-resistant because they don't rely on the prefrontal cortex, which stress tends to impair. As you execute actions, especially familiar ones, the brain receives feedback. The action was completed, the outcome was predictable, the training worked. That feedback begins to regulate the stress response, not eliminate it. Regulate it. A study at Stanford measured this in real time. Participants were placed in high-stress simulations, public speaking, difficult problem-solving under time pressure. Researchers found that emotional state didn't predict performance, but action did. The participants who began acting before they felt ready performed better than those who waited until anxiety decreased. More importantly, the act of beginning, of taking the first step despite discomfort, accelerated emotional regulation. Anxiety decreased faster in the doing than in the waiting. The implication is radical. You don't wait for calm. You initiate action, and calm becomes possible. Combat veterans describe this as getting into the rhythm. A Marine who served in Fallujah explained, "The first seconds of contact are pure chaos. Your body is screaming. Everything in you wants to freeze or run, but you start doing what you trained to do. Find cover, return fire, communicate position. After about 30 seconds of that, something shifts. You're still scared, but you're functional. The action creates a kind of structure, and the structure makes the fear manageable." Emergency room physicians report the same phenomenon. A doctor at a level 1 trauma center described her first mass casualty event. 6 patients arrived simultaneously, all critical. I froze for maybe 2 seconds. Then I started triaging. After the first decision, the second came easier. By the third patient, I was in a state I can only describe as flow. Not calm, not relaxed, but totally focused. The fear was there, but it was background noise. This is procedural grounding. When trained actions take over, they provide cognitive scaffolding that the conscious mind can lean on. The procedure carries you when willpower can't. And firefighters call it letting the training run the call. Surgeons call it trusting the protocol. Pilots call it flying by the numbers. All of them describe the same process. Action before emotion. Doing before feeling. Apollo 13 remains the clearest example because the stakes were absolute and the timeline was documented minute by minute. When carbon dioxide reached dangerous levels, the crew didn't discuss how they felt about it. They built an adapter using duct tape, plastic bags, and cardboard from procedure manuals. When they needed to course correct without computer guidance, they didn't wait until their hands stopped shaking. They used manual controls and physical landmarks. Lovell later said, "We never felt in control. We felt we were barely holding on. But we kept executing the next step, and the next one, and eventually, as we splashed down." Here's what that means for anyone facing pressure. The feeling of readiness is unreliable. Waiting for confidence before acting often means never acting. The sequence is backwards. You don't feel calm, then perform. You perform, then sometimes, not always, but sometimes, calm emerges as a consequence. A hostage negotiator with 20 years of experience put it simply, "I've never felt calm before picking up the phone. Never, but I pick it up anyway. And somewhere in the conversation, my training takes over. My voice steadies, my thinking clears, not because I conquered my fear beforehand, but because I started talking despite it." This is the final inversion, the last assumption that has to collapse. Calm is not a prerequisite for action. It's a potential byproduct. The 5 mistakes all stem from the same root error: treating stress responses as problems to solve before you can act effectively, suppressing fear, forcing relaxation, fixating on outcomes, fighting adrenaline, waiting for calm. All of them delay action. All of them increase stress. All of them make pressure worse. The people who performed best under history's most extreme pressures did the opposite. They acknowledged fear. They accepted activation. They narrowed focus. They channeled adrenaline. They acted before they felt ready, not because they were braver, not because they were stronger, but because they understood something most people don't. Calm under pressure isn't something you feel. It's something you do.